So with Naledi Pando's announcement that she's not going to be taking part in any position in the new cabinet of the Government of National Unity, Helen Zille is actually in this really interesting conversation with Clement Manyathela of Radio 702, describing and explaining probably how the GNU would tackle the issue of South Africa's support for Gaza in light of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Let's listen to Helen Zille's thoughts on this issue, and I'll be back for some really interesting analysis on the prospects for continuous South Africa support for Gaza in light of the Government of National Unity under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa.
Yeah. What about government's approach on the war in the Middle East, especially when it comes to the case in the International Court of Justice? As the Democratic Alliance, is that an approach that you are willing to back as well? Not that now that you are governing with the ANC, their approach in the last administration was quite clear, categorically clear on where they stand as a government on the war in the Middle East.
Well, we haven't made foreign policy the deciding issue in this election. You know, whatever South Africa does or says about the war in the Middle East is not going to change that situation. Our mission is to rescue South Africa. It is a hard enough task. Nowhere in the world have people created a stable, successful democracy, least of all in Africa, where there are such contesting groupings, such a strong identity vote, such differences in class, in income, in inequality. It's an incredible task. No country has ever succeeded in doing what we're doing. And in fact, one day the whole world will have to, because borders are shrinking, people are migrating, no borders or passports or visas are going to be able to stop them. And if we have to find a way of living successfully in one country, one day the world will have to turn to us and say, how did you do it? And we are on this path to try and make it successful. Let's not let conflicts elsewhere in the world railroad our chance of being an example to the world.
Brilliant. What do you guys think? I think it's really going to be tricky now that Naledi Pandor is, out, because I would say that she actually spearheaded the push for support for Palestinians, although the EFF, Julius Malema, and, some other parties came from the sidelines to, really show support for the Palestinians. Naledi Pandor and President Cyril Ramaphosa were actually those who really were at the forefront of, the speeches. You could see the speeches in the media really showing a lot of support for the Palestinians in Gaza and, their support. But in light of Minister Naledi Pandor's exit now from the Government of National Unity, it's really tricky how the Government of National Unity will tackle this issue of the conflict, between Israel and Palestine, and also even the one with Russia and, Ukraine. Because now we know that, the Government of National Unity seems to be dominated by the center-right perspective of things. And the DA party has been tricky, in its either support or in how it actually, seeks to go with the ANC support for the Palestinians. We are not yet sure on how the IFP and these other parties go, the Patriotic Alliance. We know that the Patriotic Alliance is vociferous in its support. I would say that, it has a really centrist perspective to support for Israel and Palestine. I've heard a lot of Gaten Mackenzie's speech talk about how, if we speak about the death of Palestinian children, that we should also consider the death of others. And there's no death that is more weighty than the others. But then the PA has this position that, South Africa still has its own numerous problems, and that South Africa should try to deal with its own problems first, So we can see that the PA actually deflects from the solid, full-swing ANC support for the Palestinians, which President Cyril Ramaphosa and Minister Naledi Pandor actually had to the point of pushing Israel to have a case at the International Court of Justice. And so it's really going to be tricky how the GNU, the components of the Government of National Unity, would embark on this support for Gaza, and if probably the support for Gaza would, be put somewhere or at the sidelines, or while other pressing needs for South Africans would take lead. It's really tricky how to interpret how it goes, but we'll keep watching and studying. But this same quest actually was tackled by a really interesting journalist on Al Jazeera, and I thought that this video really tried to tackle the possible scenarios by which we can try to envision the government of national unity's approach to the Israel-Palestine conflict in light of the previous, regime led by President Cyril Ramaphosa and Minister Naledi Pandor when the ANC had a majority in South Africa. So it argues that, it says when South Africa, under its ruling ANC party, took Israel to the International Court of Justice, that's in January, on allegations of genocide in Gaza. It says that it drew a lot of applause from a range of nations, especially in the global south. Okay, but it says that at home in South Africa, the support was more muted among the country's other political parties, and we see that this is likely going to be an issue now that the government of national unity seems to be a collective of most of these parties that didn't have much of the support that the ANC on the global stage, especially with support and applaud from the global south, had for the ANC in its support for Gaza. But now in the GNU, we might see a reflection of that non-support from many political parties for the ANC's push to support the Palestinians. So it says that the ANC's main rival at the time was the right-leaning Democratic Alliance, opposed the step. The DA really opposed, according to this research, the DA opposed the ANC's support for Gaza during this time, and especially its support. The DA sort of like, clashed with this whole issue of taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. So it also argues that, although the DA subsequently asked Israel to adhere to the ICJ's interim rulings, it really kind of like opposed that step to take Israel to the International Court of Justice. It says that the right-wing populist patriotic alliance called South Africa's move, that's taking South Africa, taking Israel to the International Court of Justice, the PA, which is described here in this research as a right-wing populist party, it called that move a joke, all right? So now it argues that 5 months later, the ANC has stitched together a coalition government to rule the country with the DA and, to a lesser extent, the PA and the Nationalist Inkatha Freedom Party, raising concerns. Now we know that Good and Al-Jamaa actually joined those, and UDM as well. And we know that UDM Bantus Holomisa actually also is of the opinion that South Africa will never be able to solve the crisis between Israel and Palestine, but that his own approach would be to call these two leaders together and have them to talk, rather than just the ANC taking one side. So now that there's this kind of like government of national unity, it will really be tricky how the government of national unity will respond to Gaza and Israel. But anyway, it says that, the DA, to the lesser extent, the PA and the Inkatha Freedom Party, the GNU now raises concerns about how South Africa's approach to Israel and Palestine may change in light of this GNU. It says that, the ANC insists that it will not change its position in support of Palestine, despite the new coalition government. Yet, analysts argue that a coalition-led South Africa may lead to internal trade-offs in pursuing its Palestine policy after months of leading global efforts to hold Israel accountable for its assault on Gaza, all right, which has actually killed 37,000 people, this research argues. It also speaks about the fact that, the DA and the Inkatha Freedom Party have sought to remain neutral on the war, right? So the Democratic Alliance and the IFP, led by, Velenkosi Chabisa, have actually decided to be neutral on the war, but the Patriotic Alliance has expressed heavy support, like I mentioned earlier, for Israel in this regard. And it says that in the final coalition government, there's a clause on foreign policy, right? And this clause was inserted in which the ANC and its partners agreed on the principles that foreign policy would be based on. So it was the foreign policy clause of the government of national unity. It argues that foreign policy is based on human rights, constitutionalism, and the national interest, solidarity, peaceful resolution of conflict, and to achieve the African Agenda 2063. Right? South-South, North-South, and African cooperation, multilateralism, and a just, peaceful, and equitable world. So that's what the agreement on foreign relations, right, foreign policy for the government of national unity actually reads. So it says that while the ANC has conceded that the DA is unlikely to change its position on Israel and Palestine, it has insisted that it will not give up on its long-standing solidarity with Palestinians. Now, it asks, the Secretary General Fikile Mbalula is actually telling the media now, he says that, will the ANC abandon its ideas on foreign policy? We are not going to change that. Will the DA change from what it represents? It will not change that. So this is Fikile Mbalula now saying, exemplifying or really bringing to the fore the clash that is really anticipated between the ANC and the DA. One stands for its support and solidarity for the Palestinians. The other is likely not to change in its stance, on how it sees the whole conflict between Israel and Palestine. So we've seen a lot of conflict in that regard within the government of national unity. Fikile argued that, Fikile labeled suggestions that the ANC may backtrack on its critical stance against Israel as misleading and populist. But it says that the ANC will continuously show solidarity with the people of Palestine, and that that the support for Palestine was not an election move. Now, it says that South Africa's support for Palestine is deeply rooted in its own decade-long struggle against apartheid, with President Cyril Ramaphosa repeatedly labeling Israel as an apartheid state. It also says that the DA has actually moved away from its initial steadfast support for Israel and has maintained a middle ground call for peace. Now, in the run-up to the elections, the ANC criticized the DA for taking a bold stance on the Ukraine war. DA, leader John Steenhuisen actually traveled to Kiev in a show of support against Russia's war, and while not taking a similar stance in support for Palestine. So this is the ANC's critique now to the DA, that, although the DA has a really strong stance and really strong position as regards the Russia-Ukraine war, it expects it to take that same strong stand in the Israel-Palestinian war. And the reason why the DA has that position is really not clear yet. But it says that the DA, in turn, actually in reciprocity, accused the ANC of not being principled in its foreign policy, and as a result of what it has dubbed a cozy relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So it appears that the DA's move seems to be like a tit-for-tat move, where the ANC has showed a lot of support and a lot of cozy relationship with President Vladimir Putin. We see the President Cyril Ramaphosa's role in the last Russia-Africa summit that actually really shook the world. The speeches there from the young presidents like Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso and the president of Eritrea. They really had these really powerful speeches which exonerated Russian, applauded Russia's assault against the proponents of Western values in Africa and all of that. And so probably the DA actually didn't really find that really funny, especially with the ANC promulgating a sort of like a cozy relationship with Russia. So probably this is why the DA has taken a strong stance against Russia in support for Ukraine, but then it's likely really difficult to really see where it would position itself in the struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians at this time. But then it says that the ANC government has actually condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and President Ramaphosa was clear, when the 6 leaders, African leaders, went on a mission to both Ukraine and Russia, led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, to try to negotiate a peace, a sort of like a peace between both nations. We see that the ANC in this research, it says that the ANC condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and President Ramaphosa sought to play a peacemaking role in the conflict, but he remains, or probably the ANC of President Cyril Ramaphosa remains friendly with Putin and Russia. Now it says that while the ANC has signed the agreement with its coalition partners that saw a re-election of President Cyril Ramaphosa, it actually has asserted its solidarity with Palestine at the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's Global Peace Summit in Switzerland that took a hard line against Israel. So South Africa's representative to that summit, Sydney Mufamadi, is actually President Cyril Ramaphosa's national security advisor. He actually rejected the final communique because of Israel's participation. All right, and he says that in a statement after the summit in Bergenstock, Mufamadi called out what he said were international double standards in uniformly and fairly implementing the international law. He actually also said that he found it surprising that Israel was present and signed the communique just a few days after a credible high panel committee appointed by the United Nations found out that it has, amongst the commission of other atrocity crimes, committed the crime of extermination. All right, so this is where the ANC stands, in light of the whole Israel-Gaza conflict at the moment. Now, so it says that the ANC is reliant in a way on the DA, okay? It says that Sifamalanda Zodi, who is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Johannesburg, actually said that, while the ANC as a party will not abandon its position on Palestine, it would have to compromise on government's actions, all right? And he thinks that, the ANC might not be able to pursue with its litigations and really pushing very strongly against Israel. The ANC might be crippled in that regard in its push against Israel, but it might revert to a kind of like a principled position that says that this war must end, almost similar to its position on Ukraine. So in other words, the ANC might adopt this whole peaceful negotiating machine in the Israel and Palestine conflict, rather than having a strong stance or solidarity for the Palestinians, but to have a role for being a peaceful negotiator, so to speak, to try to find peace between both countries. So it says that at the International Court of Justice, South Africa has accused Israel of genocide, and its case has been supported by more than a dozen countries. And while the DA was initially critical of the government's decision to take Israel to the International Court of Justice, it had actually said that it would abide by the court's decisions on the matter. And actually also they say that the DA stance on Palestine was consistent with center-right parties across the world. While they condemned the violence, they were not comfortable with calling Israel's actions a genocide. So this is the position of many center-right parties around the world, that, it's difficult for many of these center-right parties to really see Israel as, as a nation committing genocide at the moment in its fight back against, the Hamas's attack on Israel, but rather, the DA, especially in light of the center-right parties across the world, would be adherent to the rules of the International Court of Justice. It also argues that the coalition agreement, in South Africa would definitely affect the government's case at the ICJ, and the ANC really relies now on the DA. So anyway, it says that according to the coalition agreement, decisions in the unity government will have to be taken through what is called a sufficient consensus, right? So, sufficient consensus encapsulates the notion that a support of 60% of the parties that actually make up the coalition agreement, the government of national unity, would be what would be needed to drive any kind of policy for the nation. So it says that this means that the ANC will not be able to make decisions itself as it did previously during the leadership of regime of Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor's regime in South Africa at that time. Probably this might be the reason why she stepped down, because now she might not be able to push as it were, based on the ANC's majority in these foreign policy directives. But now that the GNU is now involved, there will be a lot of negotiations within the government prior to taking a stand on anything regarding foreign policies for South Africa. So it says that this means that the ANC will not be able to make decisions by itself, and that if the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party agree on something that the DA probably would disagree, that decision would not pass. And if the DA and the IFP both disagree, the ANC cannot work alone. So it's the whole GNU now is actually much more of a cooperative in a way that, no party can stand alone and take policies together. So many policies would likely get stuck. And we remember there's also a very vociferous opposition in light of the Progressive Caucus now being led by George Schloppe of MK Party and Julius Malema's EFF, who will be pushing from the oppositional wing against the GNU, although it's still not clear if there will be a unofficial opposition, but there will be a lot of critique coming from that wing, while even within the GNU itself there will be massive debates that would either, I suspect, would stagnate a lot of policies, moving forward, and probably brings South Africa to a standstill. As much as it's been argued that, the government of national unity is the saving grace for South Africa, it might end up being a cog in the wheel in South Africa's push to evolve to a really interesting and desirable future for all South Africans. But what do you guys think about this? It's been quite a lot of information. What do you guys think about Helen Zille's conversation with Clement here in this video? Share your thoughts in the comments.